Senator Lyons.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President, and I acknowledge that tonight I'm speaking on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and I pay my respects to leaders past and present and emerging leaders. As Stan Grant in his book Talking with My Country says, and I quote, "I grew up to understand that conflict doesn't end when the guns stop, that its legacy is passed through generations. I learned how it casts a shadow, and that shadow doesn't recede, and no matter how far we travel from the battleground, that shadow hovers still. And for as long as these unacceptable gaps in key health and other indicators are there, those gaps between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples continues, that shadow will remain." In 2008, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd delivered the national apology to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, in particular the stolen generation. Those words that Aboriginal people had waited so long to hear were followed by Labor's commitment to close the gap on Indigenous disadvantage. In March of 2008, we signed a statement of intent to close the gap, one of the few times that Parliament comes together as one, as it did on this occasion and continues to do so, the importance of everyone in this place recognising that we must close the gap. Labor's Closing the Gap framework provided for the first time in our nation's history a clear, properly funded framework that holds us all accountable to making progress. This framework was supported by the then opposition and by all Australian governments through the COAG process. Then in April of 2008, the Australian Labor government, supported by once again the opposition, agreed that the Prime Minister would provide an annual report to Parliament on progress towards closing the gap. It's worth revisiting some of this statement of intent, the commitment between the Government of Australia and the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples of Australia. Two of these commitments in particular resonate, and I quote, "Ensuring the full participation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their representative bodies in all aspects of addressing their health needs, to supporting and developing Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander community-controlled health services in urban, rural and remote areas in order to achieve lasting improvements in Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander health and well-being." Over the past weeks, we have heard many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders saying their voices are not being heard, their solutions are not being implemented. Like Stan Grant, they know that the shadow of the past doesn't recede while the gap continues, and indeed in some areas the gap has widened, that inequity is widening. We now have some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders saying that they've lost faith in the closing the gap targets and it's not working. But that's a view that's not shared by all. The chair of the Close the Gap Steering Committee, Dr Jackie Huggins, said, and I quote, "In my working life, I have never seen Aboriginal affairs at such a low point. There is no engagement, there is no respect, and I agree with Patrick Dodson and Noel Pearson that we are in deep crisis." Sometimes, Ms Huggins went on to say, Dr Huggins went on to say, "I don't feel part of this society because it breaks my heart to see the conditions my people are continually left in without any leadership from the top." Governments would be well advised to listen and to act on the recommendations of the Closing the Gap Campaign Steering Committee. The warning signs that we were not on track were there in the 2015 report. Indeed, in the executive summary of the 2015 report, the Steering Committee states that there must be a clearer connection between the Indigenous Advancement Strategy and closing the gap. The committee raised further concerns that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health gains could be negatively impacted by measures in the last budget, which cut funding to programs which target smoking rates, healthy eating, nutrition and physical activity, We all know that primary prevention through Aboriginal controlled health organisations must be the starting point. Again, in 2016, the Campaign Steering Committee states the impact of the Indigenous Advancement Strategy on the social determinants of health. A year on, the committee believes that the IAS should be nationally coordinated along with the state and territory governments, and to demonstrate how it will contribute to achieving closing the gap targets. Of course it should, and we must ask and demand why the Indigenous Advancement Strategy doesn't reflect close the gap targets. 2015 saw the launch of the implementation plan for the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Plan. This must now be appropriately funded. The committee calls for an overall increase in resources directed towards Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health, and the committee once again stresses the plan should support the preferred model for health services delivered by Aboriginal-controlled health organisations. If we look back over the last 10 years, there have been some improvements, but these improvements are too slow, and without increased focus, respectful engagement and solutions led by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations, we will fail to meet our targets. We know that Aboriginal Australians die about 10 years earlier than non-Indigenous Australians on average, and I was shocked to hear Dr Huggins say at the launch last week that in fact Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have the shortest life expectancy across the world's Indigenous peoples. And I saw her later in the day and I said, "Is that correct?" And she said, "Yes, it is." And I said, "I didn't know that stat. What a shameful stat for Australia to have." We know that there's been some decline in Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander infant mortality, but again, not fast enough to reach our goals. And sadly and significantly, employment gaps have increased rather than narrowed. Labor is calling for justice to be part of the targets, and I have to say it's a very sad day when we hear the Minister in the Turnbull government to say that he won't consider putting justice targets in, and he believes that, in fact, that would single out Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Well, they are singled out. They're absolutely overrepresented currently in the justice system. They represent juveniles. Aboriginal people represent around 6% of Australia's population, yet in my state of Western Australia, juveniles, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander juveniles make up 80% of the prison population. They are signalled out, and we need to desperately look at better solutions. It is absolutely horrific that a young Aboriginal person has more chance of being locked up than completing schooling. More chance, significantly more. Those are not statistics that we should be proud of, and indeed that we should allow to continue. Now, some of that has got to do with the harsh mandatory sentencing laws in Western Australia, but that stat is repeated across the country. And I would urge the Minister to take a real look at what's actually happening and inform himself about the appalling imprisonment rates, very high for women, very high for young juveniles. This is not something that we should allow to continue. The Steering Committee retains its optimism that we can achieve equality into the future, but to do that we must be ambitious. This generation can and should be the generation to finally close the appalling life expectancy gap between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders and non-Indigenous Australians. But it requires a new vision. It requires solutions that are led and implemented by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. It requires respect and appropriate action by the government and by oppositions. Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President.